The commissioner's concern resulted from a written complaint by former PSC Commissioner Jim Ziegler, who accuses Alabama Power of conducting a political campaign in support of Amendment 4. He says the company is spending money from the consumers who pay monthly power bills. Meanwhile, PSC President Billy Joe Capp says the commission intends to investigate the matter.
It will just be a sad day when a regulated company can expense unlimited amounts in a political issue to their ratepayers, and the ratepayers having no choice except to pay it. And what the commissioners did today was collectively state that we're going to look into this thoroughly, and if the company has caused any expenses to be put upon the ratepayers, we're going to ask them to refund that money to the ratepayers, and we will also consider and perhaps levy, I would hope that we would, if they are guilty of this, a punitive fine to be refunded in addition to the actual expenses.
Later, Alabama Power spokesman Chris Conway defended his company against Ziegler's charges.
Several inaccuracies in it. First of all, Mr. Ziegler charges that the informational campaign that we conducted to inform our employees about Amendment 4 was charged to the ratepayers. That is not true. Not one dime that the company has spent on informing employees about Amendment 4 is being charged to the ratepayers. It's all coming out of the company's retained earnings. Secondly, he charged that we forced our employees to sit down and view a 45-minute film on Amendment 4. This is incorrect. We had informational meetings our employees came to. They did not have to come. They weren't forced to come.
Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
On the amendment. And I might add that the
havoc to our society is stealing your tax dollars. The corrupt politician merely inserts the word government instead of business. He says governments are the people's money.
David Montrell, on the 23rd, John, through this pretty fast, and I'd like to have all you birthday fellas stand up.
The shoplifter goes to jail. The economic criminal, the white-collar criminal, if he happens to get caught, gets probation. And gentlemen, that's not right, and it's never going to be right. This kind of justice misses the heart of the problem. And I'm not saying that the shoplifter shouldn't go to jail. What I am saying is that the corrupt businessman, the crooked politician, he belongs behind bars too.
It's called Air South. The Mobile-based airline is currently offering 3 flights out of Montgomery with connections in Mobile, Birmingham, and New Orleans. But by the 15th of this month, Air South hopes to have another flight to Lafayette and Lake Charles, Louisiana. Station manager Lisa Harbour says Air South started service last June. The pilots fly 19 passenger square-engine Metroliner planes that are made in Antonio, Texas. Harbour says she thinks Air South will do very well in Montgomery because it will give passengers an alternative for West Coast connections. She says instead of going to Atlanta, the passengers can now make those connections in New Orleans. As far as prices are concerned, Air South charges $89 to New Orleans, $59 to Birmingham and Mobile. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
This map outlines the new districts in the state. There used to be 9, now there are 7. Every district used to have a county office, but now 2 are closing. Richie says Fayette and Choctaw counties have an insufficient workload. That's why they're closing. He says the district offices in Camden and Columbiana will also be closed and their boundaries realigned to balance the workload among the 7 districts.
And what we're doing is actually picking those high traffic or those high work level areas to put those highly experienced people in so that we can increase the efficiency of the office.
Richie says no one will suffer because of this restructuring. Farmers in the counties where offices are closing will still be able to meet with FHA officials. Office hours will be set in each of the counties for farmers to get assistance, and those times will be posted. While 2 district offices and 2 county offices will be closed, Richie says no one will be fired. He says 26 employees will be shifted into other areas, bringing more expertise into the counties. He says some positions may be downgraded, but the salary levels will stay the same. And what's unusual about this restructuring program is that more people will have to be hired. Richie says he needs 17 additional workers, mostly in the clerical areas. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
We have a very extreme situation in as far as the farm situation is concerned, with low liquidity and the very high interest rates. And, you know, they've had bad weather, and then when we get good weather, the commodity prices are so low, it's very difficult for these fellows to make a living. So Farmers Home Administration is getting out here and extending our credit line to them, trying to help them out.
Richie says their business is credit of the last resort. He says if the individual merits it, he'll go to the wall to help them qualify for a loan. Richie is restructuring the FHA, closing some offices and realigning others. He says that will cut down on bureaucratic red tape and better serve the people of Alabama. He says he's closing 2 of the district offices and moving top supervisors into county offices. He says now caseloads will be more evenly distributed, as will the expertise. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
Hope is accused of offering Jet $2,500 to hire someone to kill Graddick. As the trial started today, the prosecution, led by Colbert County District Attorney James Patton, told a jury of 5 men and 7 women that evidence is expected to show Hope wanted Graddick killed for his involvement in the murder convictions of 2 of Hope's sons. Patton says Hope was mad at Graddick for aiding in the prosecution of his sons and for Graddick's hard line against paroles. The defense, made up of the father and son team of Lawrence Sheffield Jr. and Lawrence Sheffield III, told the jury Hope is an upstanding citizen who, although he is bitter over his son's convictions, would never go outside the law to fight those convictions. The first prosecution witness was an investigator for the Department of Corrections, Rod Manning. He testified that he had had conversations with Jet and heard telephone conversations between Jet and a man who he thought to be Hope, in which plans to have Graddick and the Shelby County District Attorney killed were discussed. Sheffield spent much of the cross-examination asking Manning questions about when, where, and how those conversations took place, and why only some were recorded. Sheffield was clearly suggesting the Alabama Bureau of Investigation and Jet were trying to frame an innocent man. Sheffield says Jet is a liar who will do anything to get in good with state authorities so he might get paroled from his life sentence in prison. Graddick made a brief appearance late in the day just to say he did and does oppose the parole of Hope's sons. But clearly the evidence drawing the most attention was a tape-recorded conversation allegedly between Manning and Jet, in which Manning asked Jet about a conversation he had with Hope. Manning on tape asked, "What did he ask you to do?" Jet replies, "To get someone to kill Charlie Graddick." Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News in Elmore County.
Banded by Clipper, 14, Mike Sanderson. Banded by...
Widen the UAB lead to as much as 14. The tournament MVP converts this 18-footer into a 3-point play. Robinson led the Blazers with 24 as UAB won it going away 94-83 to win their first ever Sun Belt Conference championship. They now look to the NCAA tournament.
The prosecution is led by Colbert County District Attorney James Patton. His opening statement today suggested that much of the state's case will rely on testimony by Jet and recorded telephone conversations allegedly between Jet and Hope, in which a plan to murder Graddick and the Shelby County District Attorney was discussed. The defense is a father and son team, Lawrence Sheffield Jr. and Lawrence Sheffield III. The senior Sheffield spent much of this first day in the trial suggesting Jett and the Alabama Bureau of Investigation are trying to frame an innocent man. The first witness of the day was an investigator for the Alabama Department of Corrections, Rod Manning. During his testimony, the prosecution introduced a tape recording of a conversation that allegedly took place between Manning and Jett. Manning identified the first voice on tape as Jett's, the second as his own. The first voice says Hope asked him, meaning Jett, to have Graddick killed. The second voice asks if the request was serious. The first voice replies, "I've never seen anyone more serious in my life." The prosecution is saying Hope is mad at Graddick for the part he played in the murder convictions of two of Hope's sons, and because Graddick is opposed to parole for the Hope boys. Graddick appeared late today to say he has been and still is opposed to the paroles. Both prosecution and defense attorneys say they think the first day in court went well. The trial resumes at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News at the Elmore County Courthouse.
For the second time in the last 4 years, Birmingham Southern has handled the Hornets on their home court in the district playoffs. The Panthers just dominated all phases of tonight's game. They bolted out to as much as a 12-point first-half lead on many easy inside buckets. Carl Flowers led the way for Southern with 25 points, 2 on that layup. Carl Crosby added 19. That's him scoring on the Snowbird. Bama State shot a miserable 43% from the field, but they did manage to fight back within one late in the second half. Melvin Armstrong leading the way with 25. That's him scoring on a baseline jumper. Fred Freeman chipped in 17. He converts here on a three-point play from the key. But in the end, the Panthers would win it from the free throw line. They hit 18 of 22 from the charity stripe in the second half to stay in front and keep the Hornets at bay. The final from Dunn Arena tonight, Birmingham Southern 82, Alabama State 77. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports.
Assistant State Finance Director Dr. Raymond Wells told Prison Board committee members that the quality of health care services outlined in both contracts is basically the same. The contracts differ in the number of staff members, but Dr. Wells says that's a minor difference, and there's a $1.7 million difference in the cost for the health care service.
Representatives from both Prison Management Systems of Birmingham and Correctional Medical Systems of St. Louis defended their company's contracts. PMS currently provides medical services for the state's 4,300 inmates. Their 3-year contract expires November 19th of this year, and PMS Representative Fred Payne made note of his company's good track record.
In the 2.5 years since we've been in operation in Alabama, we have had only encouraging remarks from anyone that has viewed the prison system and the health care that has been presented.
Payne was concerned about the difference in the sizes of staff proposed by the two companies. He says his competition plans to hire 20 to 80 fewer people than his company. Committee member Big Ed Robertson of Tuscaloosa County questioned Correctional Medical Systems Representative Jerry Schreiber about the fact that his company, which is based in St. Louis, would be operating the medical facilities here in Alabama. Schreiber told him CMS is setting up a regional office in Montgomery this September and will be recruiting staff members locally and statewide. Schreiber said his company hasn't started actively recruiting because the contract hasn't been signed. Committee member Rio Kirkland of Bruton says he wants more information about the contracts before making a final decision. Fellow members echoed that concern, and now they'll review the contracts in the next few days. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News. One of the main differences in the two 3-year contracts is the cost. The $25.5 million price tag for the Correctional Medical Services of St. Louis is about $1.7 million less than the Prison Management Systems of Birmingham's contract bid of about $27 million. Prison Commissioner Joe Hopper says contract negotiations are in the final stages with a new contract for the state's 4,300 inmates effective November 20th of this year. But committee members want to study the invitation and original bids and contracts before any final decisions are made. Both contracts have been reviewed, and Assistant State Finance Director Dr. Raymond Wells says there's basically no difference in the quality of health services for state inmates. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
If you went to the polls today, you probably found it very easy to walk in, vote, and walk out in just a few minutes. According to midday reports given to the Secretary of State's office, most polling places throughout the state were that way. Only 9 of the 23 amendments affect the entire state, and none is exclusively for Montgomery County. There's some speculation that voters will only vote for the amendments that apply to their particular area. But John Morgan of the Secretary of State's office says it's too early to tell. One of the hottest items on the ballot is Amendment Number 4, the Co-Employee Liability Law. Before the election, there were massive advertising campaigns both for and against the amendment. Those for the amendment say it will attract more industry to the state. Those against say it will eliminate a basic constitutional right. Since voter turnout has been so light, officials in the Montgomery County Probate Judge's office say it won't take long to count the results. One person in that office said the probate judge should be able to tell the results in just a couple of hours. But Alabamians may have to wait until tomorrow to find out the results of the election statewide. Officials just aren't sure when at this point. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
She drove herself and she drove herself in the victim's car.
It was a relatively short day of work for the House. Education forces were able to quickly adopt some changes in the budget which made room for a 16% teacher pay raise. The change came when education forces, some 70 strong, managed to strike the near $9 million Department of Youth Services from the education budget and put it into the general fund. Even though the education forces outnumbered the House leadership 2-1, they failed to override a House rule preventing any education budget from passing that doesn't contain at least a $20 million surplus. The budget, as finally amended, only has a $48,000 surplus, so the House version of the education budget slips back into the House calendar. It'll be at least 2 weeks before any additional action on the House education budget can come up, since the House is bound by rules to begin considering sunset legislation next Thursday. Over in the Senate, the legislators worked on the general fund budget, bloated by a number of amendments that were adopted so fast the final outcome isn't known yet. The Senate general fund budget was burdened with more than $17 million worth of programs that Senate committee members cut out of the education budget earlier in order to make room for the 16% teacher pay raise. Some Senate members objected to the fast action of the amendments on the floor of the Senate, delaying the final vote. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Ellard has been convicted of raping and killing 2 women. One victim was Charlotte Parks of Birmingham. The other, Sandra Swisher, was a student at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Her body was found in Douglas County, Georgia. When Ellard was paroled in Alabama, he was transferred to Georgia to serve out a life sentence there for Swisher's murder. Braddock says when he gets Ellard back into Alabama, he wants the Pardons and Parole Board to hold a public hearing so that witnesses can testify for and against putting Ellard back into prison. Braddock says one of the witnesses he wants to call is Nancy Kahn, a woman from Birmingham who survived one of Ellard's attacks. Braddock says bringing a parolee back to the state for reconsideration is unique, but he says the Pardons and Parole Board didn't comply with all the requirements when they released Ellard last summer.
I think at one time their excuse for paroling Ellard was that they were merely paroling him to the state of Georgia where he was under a life sentence at that time for another murder and rape. Well, the truth of the matter is he was eligible for parole in Georgia when he was sent there.
Braddock says the parole board must examine Ellard's criminal history and the details of those crimes. He says last March the board didn't fully examine Ellard's background because board members didn't know he'd escaped twice from prison after he had been convicted. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News. Nancy Kahn led the fight to keep Ellard in prison by telling horror stories of her ordeal. She said Ellard assaulted her, punched her eye out, locked her in the trunk of a car for 2 days alongside her dead cousin, and then tried to drown her. Attorney General Charles Braddock says he wants Mrs. Kahn to testify at a public hearing when Ellard returns to the state.
I expect other witnesses will testify as to his prior criminal history and the details of the prior crimes. I'm confident that the board, after hearing these details, would have a very difficult time doing nothing other than sending him back to the penitentiary system here in Alabama.
Braddock began protesting Ellard's release a year ago, saying the Pardons and Paroles Board didn't thoroughly examine Ellard's criminal history. Governor James and Georgia Governor George Busbee signed an executive agreement to have Ellard return to Alabama, but Ellard challenged the agreement. Now the Georgia Supreme Court has upheld that agreement, and Braddock says Ellard should be here within a couple of weeks. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
Cooper says he's strongly concerned with the growing number of political action committees because of their power and influence in elections nationally and locally. He says in 1974 there were only 10 PACs in the state. Now he says there are nearly 300. Currently under state law, Cooper says political action committees, unlike lobbyists, are not required to register with the state. Under what Cooper called lax guidelines, the PAC's members are, according to Cooper, unidentifiable, but yet have the power and money to elect constitutional officers in the upcoming election, and at least 90% of the legislative seats which will be contested in Alabama this year. Cooper went on to say that in his opinion, PACs are weakening the two major political parties, which is a direct threat to democracy. He says the most alarming fact is that the election of a party's candidate in the future could depend less and less on what his constituents want and more on what PAC supporters demand. Cooper did offer some solutions to lessen the power of PACs. One would require registration of all political action committee members and full disclosure of financial records. A second would limit the length of campaigns, which would begin no earlier than July 15th and end on the Sunday in September prior to the Tuesday primary. Another suggestion would require PACs to donate $1 to any challenger for each $2 contributed to an incumbent. In addition, Cooper says a certain limit should be set on the amount of money a political action committee can spend on a campaign. In closing, Cooper warned that if PACs grow too numerous and too dominant, they could lose whatever legitimate role they may have been able to play in the American political system. Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
What it had to do with part of our protection against corrosion of our underground gas system that we were cited in 4 different areas. And we've already gone about correcting that, and we've already notified them that we're in compliance, so they will schedule their inspector to come back the first of next week for another field visit. There was a lot of the requirements that we are in compliance with, and they have been out here 3 or 4 times, and it's just I probably did a poor job in scheduling my work, but we've made those adjustments now, and we're in compliance now.
Alabama trial lawyers and labor leaders have been against Amendment Number 4 from the very beginning. Tonight at a party at the Governor's House Motel, they celebrated the defeat of Amendment Number 4. One trial lawyer said the voting represented a cross-section of the state, of labor and the working people.
I think they've gone to the polls, and they've said they have certain rights that are protected by the Constitution. One of those is a jury system, and it's based on neighbors and friends making decisions. And that system is based on trust. And they said, we trust each other. We'll put 12 men and women in the box, and we'll let them make a fair determination.
Representatives from a number of labor organizations like the IBEW, Plumbers and Steamfitters, and the Montgomery Firefighters all said they're quite pleased with the result of the election. And a few predicted that labor will unite with trial lawyers again on other major issues. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
1973.
37, 44, 30, 47, 46, 27, 20, 4, 12, 24, 23.
This is Elsa. Elsa's a 3-week-old African lion cub born in a Florida compound. It's difficult to believe this small animal, as cute as she is right now, will weigh up to 350 pounds in just a year's period of time. A lot of people are concerned about these animals becoming extinct, so some organizations are taking necessary steps to make sure these animals will be around for a long time. One such organization is Ingersoll's Exotic Felines of Gainesville, Florida, who specialize in Siberian tigers, leopards, black Sumatra leopards, and lions. Head trainer for Ingersoll's, Tony Bokanugan, says the organization is very concerned with the preservation of the big cats for future generations. And he says he believes that with proper management, the animals will be around for a long time.
We think we have enough animals to work with now. If we work with them properly and breed them, we don't inline breed them, we ought to be able to do just fine with what we have.
To help support the breeding efforts of the organization, a display is set up for visitors to have their picture taken with one of the lion cubs for a small fee. The 3-week-old lion cubs and all the other animals will be here the rest of this week at Montgomery Mall. Matt Carmack, WSFA TV News.
It became a discussion of electronics. Just what can a tape recording reveal about a conversation or the people involved in the conversation? The prosecution, led by James Patton, presented over a dozen tape recordings of conversations allegedly between Hope and state prison inmate Jesse Jett. The prosecution says the tapes will prove Hope offered Jett $2,500 to have Graddick killed. Along with the tapes came a string of law enforcement officials involved in the recording and/or reproduction of the tapes. The prosecution attempted to use testimony by these witnesses to authenticate the tapes, trying to prove that the tapes are accurate reproductions of numerous conversations that supposedly took place by phone and in person between Hope and Jett last May. But the defense, led by Lawrence Sheffield Jr., continues to argue that the tapes have not been authenticated. Sheffield is suggesting the tapes have been passed through too many hands and that many of the people appearing to identify the tapes have not heard them for several months, and so, Sheffield says, they cannot be sure the tapes have not been altered. And Sheffield continually fights attempts by the prosecution and witnesses to identify a voice on the tapes as Hope's. So far, the prosecution has not produced anyone who will say they know it is Hope's voice on the tapes. Another argument centers on the clarity of the tapes. Several witnesses have testified that large portions of some tapes can't be understood because of excessive background noise on the tapes. The prosecution has introduced electronically enhanced copies of those tapes, which Patton says makes it easier to understand what is said on the original tapes. Sheffield says, if you can't understand what's on the original, how can you tell the enhanced copy was made from the original? So far, none of the tapes introduced today has been played in court, though a tape recorder was kept standing by in the courtroom all day. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News in Elmore County.
Although the Senate was debating the state's general fund budget and the House the education budget, both were really dealing with the 16% teacher pay raise issue. As the Senate debated the general fund budget, the effort was to squeeze more than $17 million worth of programs into the general fund that earlier had been cut from the education budget. The move left the education budget with room for the 16% increase rather than the 14% increase proposed by the administration. But that same move also left several departments in the general fund with drastically cut budgets, primarily the Departments of Mental Health and Corrections. At this point, the Senate hasn't changed the administration's push for a 10% state employee pay raise. The Senate has now completed its work on its versions of the education and the general fund budget. The House hasn't dealt with its version of the general fund budget, but acted on its education budget today. The House members voted on a 2-to-1 margin to follow the example of the Senate and cut out a nearly $9 million program from the education budget, saying it could be absorbed by the general fund. This made room in the House version of the education fund for a 16% teacher pay raise. But because the House version of the education budget doesn't have a mandated $20 million reserve, there weren't enough votes to override a rule keeping the House education budget from coming up for a final vote. Although the majority of both houses appear willing to shift funds around and spend almost every penny in order to pass the 16% pay raise, the small handful of holdouts in the House leadership can apparently still control any education budget passed out of the House. Since the House must by law begin considering sunset legislation Thursday, any test of this small group's strength will be delayed for a week or so. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
The tapes were accompanied by an array of state and federal officials involved in the recording and reproduction of the tapes, trying to establish that the tapes contain just what the prosecution says they contain. Conversations between Hope and Jet, in which Hope allegedly offers Jet $2,500 for Graddick's murder. But there are problems with the tapes. The defense and even some prosecution witnesses say parts of some of the original recordings can't be understood because of background noise. The prosecution has attempted to remedy the problem by submitting electronically enhanced copies of the tapes, copies where the background noises have been, in a sense, filtered out. The man in charge of that enhancing of the tapes, Federal Bureau of Investigation Sound and Electronics Technician Donald Rittenauer, appeared today to explain to the jury how the tape was cleaned up. But the defense, headed by Lawrence Sheffield Jr., has argued that in cleaning up the tapes, some portions may be lost, and that might mean the tapes are no longer true representations of what was or wasn't said in the conversation.
Well, it's obviously a frame-up. Jesse Jett engineered this thing. Alabama Bureau of Investigation got interested when he brought Charlie Graddick into it, and the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, in effect, caused this whole thing to happen.
The tapes introduced today have not yet been played in court, and no voice on the tapes has been identified as Hope's. What the prosecution tried to accomplish today was to convince the jury that the tapes are authentic, and to strongly suggest that Hope was at State and Correctional Center visiting Jet the days that at least some of the recordings were made. The trial resumes tomorrow. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News at the Elmore County Courthouse.
Graddick says his bill is a lot stronger than the one offered by the Crime Commission and says it would be much more effective in keeping dangerous criminals off the streets. Graddick says his piece of legislation would allow crime victims or their family members to speak out when an inmate comes up for parole. Graddick's bill would open such hearings that are now closed to the public. In addition, a longer notification period would be imposed regarding a hearing, and said hearing would be advertised in local newspapers. Graddick further states that the prosecuting attorney and the judge who tried the case would also be notified even if they are no longer in office. Graddick's bill would also require the notification of the sheriff or the police chief in the county where the parolee would be released. Another aspect of Graddick's proposal that is not contained in the Crime Commission's bill is that the inmate's date of conviction and length of conviction, along with his name and parole date, also be publicized. In addition, the victim or his family, if deceased, would be notified and would be allowed to attend the parole hearing. To help get passage of his bill, Graddick has the support of Senator Rio Kirkland and Representative Curtis Smith, who will each substitute the piece of legislation for the one offered by the Crime Commission. From the Attorney General's office, Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
The State Chamber of Commerce was a big supporter of Amendment Number 4. Spokesman Holman Head says they're disappointed in the outcome of the election. Head says he feels that in the long run, the law as is will be detrimental to the industrial growth and development in the state. And he attributes the amendment's overwhelming defeat to confusion and misinformation given by the opposition during the campaign. But those who oppose the amendment are jubilant about its defeat. Last night, Alabama trial lawyers and labor leaders gathered to celebrate their victory. One trial lawyer says those voting against the amendment represent a cross-section of labor and working people.
I think they've gone to the polls, and they've said they have certain rights that are protected by the Constitution. One of those is a jury system, and it's based on neighbors and friends making decisions, and that system is based on trust. And they said, we trust each other, we'll put 12 men and women in the box, and we'll let them make a fair determination.
Representatives from such labor groups as the plumber and steam fitters, IBEW, and the Montgomery firefighters predict they'll join with the trial lawyers again in the future on other major issues. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
All the charges were false, and personally, I'm glad it's over.
Reverend Knutson says his only involvement with the Bethesda Home for Girls was finding a home for Candy H., the plaintiff in the case, and taking her to the home last January 25th. Knutson says he met the institution's director, Bob Wills, at a preacher's conference quite a while ago and went to the home on one other occasion before returning last January with Candy H., who was pregnant and needed help. Knutson says he was impressed with the facilities, which was one of the reasons for recommending the home.
I knew that they helped the young ladies pursue their high school education. I knew that they had a Christian environment. I knew that there were people there that generally had concern for the young ladies, just as I did, and would try to help her. That's really about all that I was aware of.
Now, Knutson's attorneys are seeking a retraction for the accusations made against Knutson. Attorney George Azar says his client's good reputation has been smeared. He says Knutson was totally innocent and was confident of a victory in the event of court action. And Knutson says he will continue preaching the gospel, although the byproducts of his name and reputation have been slandered, remains with him. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Just help people preach the Bible. Once again, I don't know how much.
Knutson says he learned through friends of a young pregnant girl who needed help. He recommended the Hattiesburg, Mississippi home, described by Knutson's attorneys as a place for wayward-type kids. Knutson says he was impressed with the facilities because of its religious posture and because it helps students continue their high school education. He did not want to comment about the current allegations against the home.
Never thought that there would be any evidence at all of any illegalities going on. I could not in all good conscience as a minister of the gospel do anything like that. And I did what I thought was best for a young lady in trouble. That's about the entire part that I had in it.
Now, attorneys George Azar and Bill Sawyer are seeking a retraction of the allegations against their client.
The retractions will come from those who made them, and many of the charges that were made by the attorneys personally in interviews they gave to the press. Accusations were made in the charges that were leveled in the complaint itself, and we would expect that those charges to be retracted.
And Knutson says he'll continue preaching the gospel and wants to build a church for a small congregation. Meanwhile, lawsuits against the home with charges ranging from keeping young girls against their will to selling babies continues. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
The higher salary increase was offered by Ways and Means Committee Chairman Walter Owens. He says the general fund will be able to afford the extra pay hike because of some $9 million or so the employee retirement system says it won't need next year after all. This could, however, jeopardize AEA-backed efforts to use that unneeded retirement money to help absorb programs cut out of the education budget to make room for a 16% teacher pay hike. It was also brought out in committee that when the 12% increase is coupled with an expected 3% increase due to reclassification and merit raises, state employees would, on an average, see about a 15% pay hike. Meanwhile, the Legislative Oversight Committee on the proposed reclassification plan met in the House chamber with about 200 state employees watching. A number of employees testified, many saying the proposed plan had discrepancies in the salary ranges. The plan was prompted by the Personnel Board to realign salaries set many years ago and was given a boost when Governor James took office. It's up to the Legislative Committee to approve the plan before it goes into effect. A bill that would provide teachers with pay hikes based on performance was approved by the Ways and Means Committee earlier. The bill allows the State Board of Education to study the feasibility of this type of incentive. The AEA opposed the bill, saying the factors for making those judgments of performance are vague and hard to apply. It suggested instead higher salaries across the board. The committee also approved a bill requiring counties to meet a minimum level of funding for county boards of education. If passed by the full legislature, as many as 33 of the state's 67 counties would have to increase property and/or sales taxes to meet the new minimum. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Jett was the only witness on this, the third day of the trial. He was on the stand about 4 hours telling the court his version of numerous phone calls and visits allegedly between Jett and Hope. Jett's picture is purposely not clearly shown here because prosecuting attorney James Patton and Judge Walter Hayden say Jett will be killed if his picture is seen by other inmates. Jett testified that he and Hope allegedly discussed not only the general agreement to have Graddick and 3 other men killed, but specific details of how the killings could be done. Jett says Hope told him he didn't know for sure how Graddick could be killed. The defense, though, presented a letter and several gifts sent to Hope and his wife from Jett, evidence the defense thinks will help show Jett lured Hope into a scheme and suggested much of the alleged plot to kill Graddick to Hope. Then late today, the prosecution began playing a series of tapes they claim are electronically enhanced copies of recordings of conversations allegedly between Hope and Jett on telephone and in Staten Correctional Center. This is part of one of the tapes supposedly made in Staten. The jury was allowed to read along on transcripts with what was supposedly said on tape, although the defense strongly protested the transcripts as being someone's interpretation of tapes the defense say cannot be understood. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News in Elmore County.
This dormitory is under construction, and theirs are now staying, and they'll be able to appreciate how very greatly needed this new dormitory building is.
Auburn is facing an uphill battle in this Southeastern Conference tournament. The Tigers finished the regular season in a tie for 7th with Vanderbilt. Thus, they must play a first-round game while the top 6 squads will get an extra day of rest. Add to that the fact that Auburn is in the same bracket with host Kentucky. The Wildcats are winners of 28 straight in Rupp Arena. But Auburn is riding a crest of optimism entering tonight's game with Mississippi State. The Tigers are fresh off a big upset of co-champion Tennessee, and they played well the final few games of the season. Also, Coach Sonny Smith can expect the services of forward Earl Hayes, a junior college transfer who's been sidelined since early season with a broken hand. The addition of Hayes will add much-needed depth for Auburn. Admittedly, it is a long shot for the Tigers to make it to the finals, but junior center Darryl Lockhart says it can be done.
I think we're going to get a little. We're going to have some get some help from the people in Kentucky, you know, crowd-wise, because of this win, and it's going to help.
So Earl getting ready to play. Can you get something out of him up there, you think?
Yeah, I think Earl's going to be ready. He's doing a lot of stuff in practice now that, you know, anybody else with a messed up arm, you know, wouldn't be able to do. So he's coming along real well. I expect him to play a little bit.
Auburn and Mississippi State split their 2 regular season games, both winning on their home court. For tonight's game in Lexington, the Tigers have been made 5-point favorites. Tip-off is 8 o'clock. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports. Florida took Vandy to the limit tonight in the opening round of the SEC tournament. With the Gators leading 46-45 and the clock running down in the second overtime, this crucial Florida turnover gave the Commodores the ball with just over a minute remaining. After a timeout, the Commodores set up a play, and with 37 seconds remaining, Phil Cox puts up this off-balance shot from the key. It goes in. Vandy leads 47-46. Florida has one last chance to tie it, but this 18-footer by Ron Harden is off. The Gators fail to get off another shot. Vandy holds on for a double overtime 47-46 win. The Commodores now face Tennessee in quarterfinal play tomorrow night. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports.
Their bill simply brings forward the existing law, and that is that the DA, the incumbent DA, and the incumbent judge be notified. Well, the Ellard case illustrates that the necessity for a requirement that not only these two be notified, but the individual judge and district attorney or prosecutor who handle a case, even though they may not be in office, also be notified. In this particular case, the Ellard case, the judge and DA did not recognize the fact that the Ellard matter was as serious as it was because they didn't have any connection with that case. System so that he can make arrangements to go pick him up. I expect that Governor James will see that Commissioner Hopper acts promptly in bringing Ellard back to the state of Alabama. To the bill that's presently pending. The questions of people to be notified, and there's no who are crime victims, the people who suffer the most in our state and who are forgotten first are the individuals who ought to have a guaranteed right to speak out when an individual who has committed a violent offense or injured them in any way is being considered for release back into our society. I think the Richard...
Dixon won on the third ballot, defeating former U.S. Attorney Barry Teague for the recommendation. In the beginning, there were 4 nominees: Dixon, Teague, Pat Harris, and Reggie Sorrells. Each had 5 minutes to tell the executive committee a little about themselves, their political philosophy, and why they'd be the best choice. Dixon and Teague both cited previous records and local support as qualifications. Dixon is currently serving as a representative in the Alabama House, and Teague is in private practice and has already been endorsed by local members of the state executive committee. Sorrells and Harris have little political background, but they pledged they'd do all they could for the party. Sorrells works with the Alabama Association of County Commissions, and Harris is on Supreme Court Justice Bo Torbert's staff.
I believe the Democratic Party will put up the best candidate. It's my hope that we'll have the problems of deciding who's going to be the incumbent by the time September rolls around.
You think you still do have a chance to get the nomination if the state committee maybe votes against Larry?
I think there is some possibility of that.
I'm hoping that the 135 members of the Democratic Executive Committee statewide, I'm hoping that a majority of them will consider the wishes of the people who live in the district and give the Montgomery Democratic County Executive Committee's decision the respect it's due and choose me.
Larry Dixon says he'll begin campaigning tomorrow, although he's not sure he'll be the Democratic candidate because the state party will make the final decision. Whoever wins will face Gordon Tucker, who qualified today to run as the Alabama conservative candidate, and a Republican challenger who should be announced tomorrow or Friday. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News at the Democratic House.
The higher state employee raise was offered by Ways and Means Committee Chairman Walter Owens, point man in the governor's original 10% employee pay raise offer. Owens says the additional pay hike will be funded with about $8 million unneeded dollars originally budgeted for retirement. That's the same money AEA-backed forces intended to use to absorb some programs cut out of the education budget in order to fund a 16% teacher pay raise. If the AEA-backed forces try and defend their original intent for that unneeded money, it will essentially pit them against the state employees who want to use that money for their newfound increase. If both employee advocates and teacher advocates avoid that possible confrontation, then somebody could be squeezed out. And that could be the Department of Youth Services, the program that's being switched from budget to budget in this ploy by both sides to find some extra money. That's not likely, though, since the Senate has already said they're aiming for a conference committee where 3 senators and 3 representatives will decide the whole budget, which by law must stay within its means. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Jett appeared as the day's only witness, a sort of introduction to the tapes, explaining what he recalls of conversations he allegedly had with Hope in May and June last year. Jett testified that Hope told him not only that he wanted Graddick killed, but also that he wanted 3 other men killed who were involved in the murder convictions of 2 of Hope's sons. And Jett says Hope told him just how to kill those 3 men, but did not know how to go about killing Graddick. The defense spent nearly a half hour of the cross-examination asking Jett questions about his record as a criminal, a record that includes convictions for burglary, arson, rape, and carnal knowledge. The defense is apparently trying to establish that Jett is untrustworthy, that he would think nothing of lying to get special favors from state authorities. Jett denies that he would do that and says he's been offered no special treatment in return for his testimony. Then halfway through the afternoon session, the prosecution started playing electronically enhanced copies of the tapes they say are records of conversations between Hope and Jett. This is part of a tape the prosecution says was made with a hidden microphone during an alleged conversation between Hope and Jett at State and Correctional Center May 16th last year. The defense says this tape and many of the other 15 tapes the prosecution has presented can't be understood much of the time. The prosecution says enough can be understood to make the tapes an important part of their case. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News in Elmore County.
Harrison Williams walked to the Senate chambers a man still hoping for vindication.
I feel as though I have an opportunity to prove that I should be staying in the Senate. That's what this hearing is all about, as far as I'm concerned. I did nothing wrong, and I now have a chance to not only demonstrate that I did nothing wrong, but there was the most outrageous misconduct on the part of people working for the government.
Caught on camera by the FBI during Abscam, Williams already stands convicted of bribery for promising to trade his influence for profit on a mining deal. Difficult, distasteful, painful were the words as the Senate began debate. It has not expelled one of its own since the Civil War. Ethics Chairman Wallop of Wyoming said Williams had brought the Senate into dishonor and disrepute. Williams listened, his head at times hidden by his hand, as Heflin of Alabama said, he pledged to abuse his office, his public trust, for which now he must be expelled. Williams sat and let others speak in his defense the first day. Inoue of Hawaii said the FBI should not be allowed to test the weaknesses of any member of the Senate to try to corrupt the uncorrupted. Inoue warned it could happen to any one of us. The Senate will vote on whether to expel Williams or compromise on a judgment less harsh on Monday or Tuesday. James Polk, NBC News at the Capitol.
Much of the day was spent listening to the tapes allegedly recorded in State and Correctional Center in May last year. Although some words, phrases, and sentences could at times be understood, background noises on the tapes were often loud. But recordings of several person-to-person telephone calls allegedly made by Jett to Hope were clear much of the time. Yesterday, Jett told the jury what he remembered of the alleged telephone calls. During that testimony, Jett said Hope agreed in one conversation to leave a rifle and $500 a few dozen feet from the side of a highway near the border of Shelby and Chilton counties. Jett says he told Hope a hitman would pick up the items there. But the prosecution has presented agents from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation who say they did go to pick up the money and the rifle and could not find it. Jett says he and Hope discussed the alleged incident on the phone. Here is part of one telephone conversation played in court today.
The people getting impatient with me
Jet testified that during the same phone call, he and Hope set up another pickup point for the money and the rifle.
What about the Holiday Inn at Clinton? Holiday Inn at Clinton? Yeah. On 65. Tomorrow night? Yep. Just on 65. I just have to check in and leave it there till midnight.
More ABI agents later appeared to present photographs supposedly of Hope at Staten Prison on days earlier testimony indicated he visited Jet. The agents also showed a videotape they say is of Hope in his car at an earlier drop site where Hope allegedly failed to leave the money and rifle. The defense continues to suggest ABI agents have been selective in their evidence gathering, so much so that the way the evidence was collected was unfairly biased against Hope. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News at the Elmore County Courthouse.
There are 16 tapes in the prosecution's evidence. Some were allegedly made with a hidden microphone during conversations between Hope and Jet in the visiting room at Staten Correctional Center. On those tapes, there is a lot of background noise. But other tapes of telephone conversations allegedly between Hope and Jet during May last year are clearer. This is part of one of those tapes.
And I want to speak to Mr. Hubert Hope.
Thank you. Your name?
Jesse Jet.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello, call for Hubert Hope from Jesse Jet. Will you accept?
Yeah, boy. Mr. Hope. Yeah, buddy. How things going? Pretty good.
Yesterday, when Jet appeared, he told jurors that he and Hope agreed several times on various locations for Hope to place a rifle and $500, the alleged down payment and means for Graddick's murder. But Jet says 2 early plans for the drop failed. One time, Jet says Hope saw some sort of man in a uniform who Hope thought was watching him. Jet says the next time, an ABI agent posed as the alleged hitman who was supposed to pick up the rifle and money at a site close to a highway at the Shelby-Chilton County border, but couldn't find the weapons or the money where Hope allegedly said he'd put them. Jet testified that he and Hope talked about the incident on the phone the day after it supposedly happened.
You must have been scared of snakes. No, he was there. I was too. Yeah, I saw it. Huh? I was there. He didn't find it. Well, I know, but he could if he'd walked out there a little bit.
ABI agents also appeared late today, bringing photographs and videotapes of a man they claim is Hope, trying to place that man at Staten Prison, where Jet was staying last May, and at the supposed scene of one of the drops that failed. Defense attorney Lawrence Sheffield Jr. has called the state's case a frame-up from the beginning. He is now apparently trying to suggest that agents working on the case acted with a predetermined and unfair bias against Hope. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News at the Elmore County Courthouse.
Went to get my hair cut at my barber in Atlanta. Well, this is very nice.
Do you shampoo your own hair?
I usually send it out.
Well, I had it for preppable last time I got to Stacey's airport.
Well, I have more minutes for... I have 6
Tuesday, a majority of the House members bucked the House leadership and their proposed 14% teacher pay raise in favor of a 16% increase. They also adopted Representative Elvis Narramore's 16% increase for lunchroom workers. Today, the House leadership took a surprise move and joined the AEA-backed members, passing the budget and sending it on to the Senate. But then it was learned that the Narramore lunchroom worker amendment was drafted in such a way that it repealed the 16% increase for teachers, leaving them with 14%. The AEA floor leaders were upset, accusing the House leadership of hoodwinking the members by not letting them know about the error. But Representative Rick Manley, who offered the motion to approve the budgets, said he was surprised that AEA didn't screen the bill closely enough to find their own error. He said it was their own mistake and not anyone else's. Governor James, meanwhile, said he was disappointed that the legislature had taken a step toward a 16% teacher pay raise and 12% employee pay raise when it appears to him that the state won't be able to afford either. The governor says his original offer of 14% for teachers and 10% for state employees is competitive, fair, and the only thing affordable. But the governor has called his news conference for another reason, to talk about the voter passage of his oil windfall investment plan. He said it's now time to turn attention toward other real issues, which include his reform measures for education, state personnel retirement benefits, and crime laws. The governor was critical that his hue and cry about what he called the out-of-line cost of state government wasn't getting enough media play. The governor says he'll continue his line of attack on the cost of government, renewing his threat to call a series of special sessions later this year. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Another person in my place, and it was given to me, okay? Now, it was given to me. All right. One is
country, U.S. industries are closing. Is there any doubt about that, gentlemen? Right now, our company, National Industries, we can go offshore, we can go to Mexico, we can have a protected industry, we can make 10 times as much money as we can in the United States. Unfortunately, we'd be laying off about 700 people in Alabama. Now, is that the way to go? We'd be taking our capital away. That's not American. It's to be changed. I'm president of National Industries, Montgomery, Alabama. We are manufacturers of electric. U.S. industries are closing. Is there any doubt about that, gentlemen? Picked up the newspaper lately? The world market. Gentlemen, the world market is the United States. Most nations can produce more now than they can afford. And let me tell you, it is conceivable that out between here and the airport, there could be 1,000 acres of land. So